just enough that I noticed the shift in the couch cushion. He was visiting for a few days, in between jobs, in between decisions. He was well into adulthood, though I still caught glimpses of the boy he used to be when he laughed at the wrong moment or rubbed the back of his neck while thinking. I had offered him the couch without much thought. Family does that. We fill space together without asking why. I remember pulling the blanket over my legs, more from habit than cold, and letting the episode play. Some show I'd already half-watched before, the kind you don't need to follow closely. For a while, we watched in comfortable silence. The refrigerator clicked in the kitchen. A car passed outside. The world kept going, indifferent and steady. I was aware of him beside me in that background way you're aware of a clock ticking. Not intrusive, just present. Then he shifted slightly and cleared his throat. "Aunt," he said, barely louder than the TV. I muted the sound and turned toward him. "Yeah?" He didn't look at me right away. His eyes stayed on the darkened screen, where our faint reflections hovered. Older me, younger him, both a little tired, both thinking more than we were saying. "Can I ask you something?" he said. There was something in his voice that made me sit up straighter. Not urgency. Something heavier. Careful. "Of course," I said. "You can ask me anything." That was when he finally looked at me, and I saw the uncertainty there. The kind that doesn't belong to teenagers, but to adults who are realizing life didn't hand them a clear map. He nodded slowly, as if weighing each word before letting it go. "Do you ever feel like you made the right choices, but still wonder who you'd be if you hadn't?" The question landed softly, but it stayed. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest, and it surprised me more than any confession could have. I leaned back against the couch, letting my eyes drift toward the window. Outside, the porch light glowed over empty steps. "All the time," I said. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is probably lying, or hasn't lived long enough yet." He let out a breath that sounded like relief, like he'd been holding it for years. We talked then, quietly, about his worries, about my past, about the space between expectation and reality. I didn't lecture. I didn't fix anything. I just listened. And when I spoke carefully, the way you do when you realize your words might matter more than you intended. As the minutes passed, the show forgotten, I felt something shift inside me too. A reminder that connection doesn't always arrive with noise or drama. Sometimes it shows up as a quiet question on a worn couch, asking you to be present. That night didn't end with answers. It ended with understanding. And as I turned the TV off, and the room settled back into silence, I knew something important had begun, even if I couldn't yet name what it was. The next morning arrived gently, the way mornings do when no one is rushing anywhere. Sunlight slipped through the blinds and traced thin lines across the living room floor. I woke before he did, or at least before he came out of the guest room, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling between my hands. I kept thinking about his question from the night before. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. It echoed things I had asked myself at different points in my life, questions that never really disappear, only change their shape. When he finally shuffled in, hair still messy, wearing a sweatshirt he'd owned since college, he looked lighter somehow. Less burdened. He smiled when he saw me, a real smile, not the polite one people use when they're unsure of their place. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. "Coffee?" "Yes, please." We sat across from each other, the table between us like a comfortable boundary, and talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, his plans for the week, a neighbor's dog that barked too much. But underneath it all, there was an awareness that something had opened between us. Not a secret, just honesty. "I didn't mean to put you on the spot last night," he said after a while, staring into his mug. "You didn't," I told him. "I'm glad you asked." He nodded. I don't really talk about that stuff with many people." "I know," I said gently. "And you don't have to unless you want to." He looked up then. "That's kind of why it felt safe." The word stayed with me. Safe. It reminded me that whatever this connection was, it rested on trust and respect, on knowing exactly where the lines were and why they mattered. We spent the rest of the morning talking in pieces. He told me about feeling behind, about watching friends settle into lives that didn't seem to fit him. I shared stories of times I'd felt the same way, even long after people assumed I had everything figured out. I didn't position myself as someone who had all the answers. I just spoke as a woman who had lived long enough to know that doubt doesn't mean failure. Later that afternoon, we went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the trees just beginning to change. We walked side by side, hands in our pockets, the rhythm of our steps matching without effort. "You know," he said, "I always thought adults just knew what they were doing." I laughed softly. "We're just better at pretending." He smiled at that, and for a moment I saw him not as my nephew or a visitor in my home, but as another human standing at the edge of his own becoming. When we returned home, the sun was lower, the house warmer with late light. He helped me make dinner. We worked quietly, passing ingredients, moving around each other with ease. Nothing rushed, nothing heavy. That evening when we sat down again in the living room, it felt different from the night before. Not tense, not expectant, just grounded. Whatever had begun with a quiet question was settling into something steady. Something that reminded me how powerful it can be to simply be there for someone without trying to turn the moment into more than it needed to be. And as I turned off the lights before bed, I felt grateful. Not for answers, but for the chance to listen and to be listened to in a way that felt honest and right. By the third day, the house no longer felt like it was hosting a visitor. It felt shared, the kind of shared space that doesn't need explanations. We moved around each other naturally, leaving notes on the counter, rinsing mugs without being asked, respecting quiet moments without pointing them out. That afternoon, rain came unexpectedly. Not a storm, just a steady, patient drizzle that softened the edges of everything outside. The sky turned the color of old paper, and the air inside felt closer, more contained. I was in the living room, sorting through a box of photographs I hadn't opened in years. Real photographs. Glossy edges, faded corners, faces frozen in moments I barely remembered living through. He wandered in and paused when he saw what I was doing. "Those old?" he asked. "Older than you," I said with a smile. He sat across from me on the floor, careful not to intrude, and I handed him one. A picture of me in my 30s, standing in front of a car I barely remembered owning, smiling with the confidence of someone who thought time was endless. "You look certain," he said. I studied the photo. I was certain about some things, completely wrong about others. He nodded, turning the photo over like it might explain itself. "It's strange seeing people you know before you knew them." "That's one of the hardest lessons," I said, realizing everyone has a whole life that existed before you entered it. He looked up at me then. "I never really thought about you having doubts. Or regrets." "I didn't talk about them," I said. "Different times. Different expectations." The rain tapped softly against the windows, a quiet punctuation between our words. I found myself telling him stories I'd never told anyone else. Not dramatic ones. Small choices. Moments where I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, or spoke when silence might have been kinder. He listened the way people rarely do anymore. No interruptions. No rush to respond. Just presence. "I think I've been afraid of disappointing people," he said after a long pause. "So I just stall." "That fear doesn't go away on its own," I told him. "But it does change when you stop carrying it alone." There was a long stretch of silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. like we had reached a place where words had done their job and could rest for a while. Later, we made soup and ate it slowly, watching the rain fade into mist. The world outside felt distant, unimportant. Inside, there was a sense of alignment, of things settling into their proper place. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how rarely we give each other permission to be unfinished. How often age is supposed to mean certainty, and youth is expected to mean confidence, when in reality both are full of questions. I realized that this unexpected time together wasn't about guidance or advice. It was about recognizing each other as whole people, standing at different points on the same uncertain path. And in that understanding, I felt something loosen inside me, a quiet acceptance, not just of him, but of myself, and of the life I had lived exactly as it had unfolded. The morning he was due to leave arrived sooner than I expected. That always happens, I think, when time has been kind. The sky was clear again, rinsed clean by the rain from the day before, and the house felt quieter even before he packed his bag. I stood at the kitchen counter slicing fruit while he folded clothes in the guest room. The small, ordinary sounds carried through the house, each one reminding me that this chapter, whatever it had been, was closing. Not ending sharply, just easing into its natural pause. When he came back into the kitchen, his bag by the door, he looked different from the day he arrived. Not transformed in some dramatic way, but steadier, as if something inside him had found its footing. "Thank you," we said, leaning against the counter. "For all of this." "You don't have to thank me," I replied. "That's what family is for." He hesitated, then nodded. I think I needed to hear that it's okay to not have everything figured out. I smiled. "If you ever meet someone who does, let me know." I still haven't. We laughed softly, and the moment stayed light, exactly as it should. There was no heaviness, no lingering tension, just mutual understanding and respect for the boundaries that had always been there, quietly holding everything in place. When it was time for him to go, we hugged at the door. Brief, familiar, uncomplicated. As he walked down the steps and turned back to wave, I felt a warmth that surprised me. Not sadness, gratitude. After he drove away, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I sat in the living room, in the same spot on the couch where it had all begun, and let the quiet settle around me. The television stayed off. The house breathed. I thought about how easily moments like these can be missed. How often we're distracted, rushing past opportunities to really see the people in front of us. That quiet question he'd asked on the couch hadn't changed my life in any obvious way, but it had reminded me of something essential. Connection doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives softly, wrapped in trust, asking only for honesty in return. In the weeks that followed, we stayed in touch. Short messages, updates about interviews. A photo of a sunrise, he said, made him think of our walk. Nothing dramatic, just threads of continuity, woven naturally into everyday life. And I found myself changed in small ways too. More patient, more willing to listen, less afraid of the questions I still carried. That unexpected evening, that quiet conversation, became a marker in my memory. Not because it crossed any lines, but because it honored them, because it showed me that growth doesn't always come from big events. Sometimes it comes from sitting still, sharing space, and letting someone speak when they're finally ready. And that, I've learned, is more than enough.